Tuesday, September 29th, 1903, 1 a.m. In Van Meter, a city located in Dallas County, Iowa, a local businessman named UG Griffiths is driving home from a business trip when he notices something strange in the town's business district. On the roof of one of the buildings is a bright shining light that never used to be there, and it makes Griffith wonder what's going on. As thoughts run through Griffith's mind, he cautiously approaches the light to see what it might be. Perhaps this is a burglar, the businessman thought to himself. But just as Griffith has that thought, the light mysteriously jumps onto the roof of another building on the other side of the street with lightning-fast speed. And then, just as quickly as the light jumps, it vanishes altogether, leaving Griffith to wonder what on earth he has just seen. About an hour later, Griffith arrives home and drifts to sleep, still turning the recent events of the morning in his mind. What he doesn't know, however, is that the very next day, the strange light is going to show up once again. All hell is going to break loose, and his hometown will never remain the same again. So, it's the next day after Griffith's troubling encounter with the strange light. The local town doctor, Dr. Alcott, keeps a room at the back of his office. So, as night falls, he retires to his little room and prepares for what he assumes will be an uneventful night. But then, at around 12:27 a.m., Dr. Alcott is startled out of sleep as a terrifyingly bright light shines directly onto his face. Unlike Griffith, Alcott isn't about to investigate this light. This isn't just someone needing urgent medical attention. He would have recognized that. This was different. So, with no time to lose, Griffith races from his bed, picks up his gun which was lying nearby, and charges out of his office to confront whoever this was. What he saw, however, was nothing he could have prepared himself to see in a million years. As Alcott poses his gun to fire at the source of the light, he suddenly gets a glimpse of the person behind the light. Except, this isn't a person. As a matter of fact, if Alcott is seeing correctly, he's looking at a half-human, half-animal creature with huge, bat-like wings. Taking a closer look at the creature, Alcott can now see precisely where the bright light is coming from, but it does nothing to resolve the mystery around this strange being. The center of the creature's forehead seems to have elongated into a horn, from which the bright light shone. Alarmed, Dr. Alcott begins to fire at the creature in rapid succession. But here's where things start to get weird. Alcott shoots at this creature not once, not twice, but 5 times. However, strangely, not even one of these shots seems to have any effect on the creature. The monster just carried on, as if Alcott was shooting a water gun at it, which made the doctor even more terrified. And so, with just one bullet left in his shotgun, Alcott makes his way back into his office, wondering what he had encountered, and knowing only a few were going to believe his claims, just like only a few believed Griffith. However, both Griffith and Alcott wouldn't have to worry for long, because the coming days were about to bring more sightings and more chaos. Our next witness is Clarence Dunn, whom most people in the town called Peter. On this particular night, Peter is on duty as a night guard for the town's local bank. He has also heard all the wild stories going around town about this mysterious creature with the bright light on its head, and he has his own theory. As far as he is concerned, this strange creature with a strange light is probably just a robber, and this night, he plans to give whoever they are a taste of his weapon. As Peter settles in for a long night's watch, the local town clock strikes 1 a.m., and just like clockwork, he hears a strange noise. As Peter would later describe it, the noise was like the sound of someone being strangled. But just as he gets up to investigate, a strange light beams at him through the front window. This light is so sudden and so bright that Peter said it almost blinded him. Thankfully, the light soon shifts away from him for a moment, and Peter heaves a sigh of relief. This relief turns out to be only momentary though, because as the source of the light begins to reveal itself, Peter's blood runs cold. It's a huge beast, just as Alcott had described. Not knowing what else to do, Peter aims his gun at the creature and fires at it point blank. Because he was in such a haste, Peter hadn't opened the window or gone outside to see the creature clearly, so the bullet passes through the glass and shatters it. The creature, however, vanishes just as quickly as it appeared, and when a thorough search is carried out the next day and nothing turns up except for giant, three-toed footprints, Peter assumes he killed the beast. Unfortunately for him and the entire town of Van Meter, he couldn't be more wrong. The very next day, early in the morning, the mysterious monster shows up once again, this time close to the town's hardware and furniture store. O.V. White, co-owner of the hardware store, is sound asleep when he is suddenly woken up by a strange rasping noise. By now, White has heard all the stories, so he wastes no time to grab his gun. As he tries to make out the source of the noise, his senses direct him to the telephone pole, where the monster he'd been hearing about sat. Now, White is an ordinarily good shot, so when he aims his gun at the creature from 15 feet and fires at it, he expects the creature to fall to the ground dead, or at least wounded. But the creature doesn't. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems like the bullet has only awakened the beast more, who has now turned its head to shine its light directly on White. As White's heart starts to race with the realization that he might have aggravated a beast he has no way of defeating, he starts to perceive a strong stench filling the air. The odor is coming from the monster, and it's so overwhelming that it almost knocks him out. And now, once again, things get weird, because this becomes the very last thing White remembers from the entire night. Meanwhile, the shot from White's gun wakes his neighbor, Sidney Gregg. So, Greg runs out to the street to find out what the commotion is about. In the middle of the street, right on the telephone pole, Greg observes a very strange creature climbing down the pole, using its beak like a parrot. When the creature gets to the ground, it stands erect, and Greg estimates that the creature has to be at least 8 feet tall. As Greg continues to observe, the creature swings the light on its beak left and right like it's searching for something. After that, it flaps its huge featherless wings and takes giant leaps into the dark of the night, like a kangaroo. But just then, the fast mail comes tearing through the town. It's obvious that this being isn't familiar with this sound, so at first, it crouches and pauses for a moment. But then, just as suddenly, it springs up and runs on all 4 feet into the abandoned coal mine. At this point, talks about the mysterious Van Meter visitor have morphed from idle gossip to full-blown citywide panic. The story by now was fixed. Every night, while everyone sleeps, a strange creature visits the town, a huge, mysterious beast that is oddly unaffected by bullets. What was really going on? The townspeople wondered. But the question was more of a plea than a request for information. Day after day, people would sit over lunch discussing the sightings, but no answers came. Someone called it some sort of antediluvian monster. But all theories that the robbers were behind the sightings or that the witnesses had simply seen things had now been taken off the table. Meanwhile, somewhere in the abandoned coal mine, the Van Meter visitor was preparing to make one final appearance, and this time, it was going to be quite the performance. I should probably mention that before now, the crew that manned the mine had been talking about some strange sounds they had heard coming out from the mine shaft. One of them even described it as the sound of Satan and a regiment of imps coming forth for a battle. Well, that Friday night into Saturday morning, the noise started once again, and this time it drew the attention of one J.I. Platt Jr. Platt worked as an operations manager at a tile and brick factory that shared grounds with the abandoned coal mine. So as he heard the sounds, he carefully made his way into the dangerous mine shafts in search of the source of these sounds. The closer Platt got to the shaft, the louder the noise got. and then, in a flash, the monster suddenly appeared at the entrance, startling Platt. Now, here's where things get terrifying. After the monster's sudden appearance at the entrance, Platt looked into the shaft once again and saw another brilliant light. And this one seemed to be coming from a smaller beast. Together, the lights from these beasts were brilliant and blinding, but then, shortly after Platt sighted them, the monsters flew past him, sailing away into the dark with their huge beaks and blinding lights leading the way. The experience was no doubt very chilling, but at least the residents of Van Meter could take comfort in the fact that they had found the monster's lair, which probably meant they could rid the town of this beast once and for all. That night, the crew at the mine decided to keep watch, waiting for the return of the beast, or more correctly, the beasts. For many hours, the men watched, but there was no sign of the Van Meter visitor. Then, around 5:46 a.m., just as dawn began to break on Saturday morning, the dark-figured, 8-foot-tall creature with huge bat-like wings appeared. Flying with its ginormous wings, the monster started to make its way into the old mine, followed closely by the second beast Platt had sighted down at the mine shaft. Without hesitation, the men who were still gathered at the mine immediately opened fire and started to shoot at the creatures. But to their shock, these creatures merely let out a horrendous, unearthly sound, and then casually slid back into the shaft, leaving a foul, overpowering stench in their wake. Once again, the Van Meter visitor had escaped unscathed. After the harrowing events of the morning, the townspeople would get together to decide what to do about these mysterious monsters who lived in the mine shafts during the day and flew about unkillable at night. In the end, they decided to lock up the monsters in the mine so they could never fly out again. But even this leaves many unanswered questions. Were the townspeople able to lock up the mine before the creatures flew out? If they did the creatures find another way out? Or if we reopen the mine shaft today, would we find their skeletons buried down there? But more to the point of our video, what exactly was this monster? This half-man, half-bat creature with the giant beak that beamed blinding light? What on earth was the Van Meter visitor? There are many theories, as you probably guess, but for the sake of time, we will take a look at the 4 most significant ones. Let's start with the prehistoric creature theory. Some have said that the Van Meter visitor was likely a prehistoric creature that got trapped in the mines, but then was accidentally freed by one of the miners. But what type of creature was it specifically? Well, there were 2 schools of thought. The Iowa people who once lived in the Van Meter region have tales of humanoid creatures known as thunderbirds who used to shoot lightning from their eyes. Interestingly, creatures resembling these thunderbirds or pterosaurs have been sighted around neighboring states of Wisconsin and Missouri. So is it possible that a couple of them migrated to Van Meter? Well, that might be. The only problem would be the beam of light, but this is probably explained by bioluminescence, which is the ability of a living organism to emit light. Unless, maybe the Van Meter visitor was actually a dragon that broke into our dimension. And as it turns out, Iowa has had, perhaps, more than its fair share of dragon visitations. 16 years before the Van Meter visitor's first sighting on August 11th in Bedford, Iowa, a man named Lee Corder sighted a mysterious flying serpent with protruding eyes and a forked tongue. Corder said the serpent's body glowed in the sun and that the creature landed hard on the ground before taking off again. 3 years later, another witness, this time in Independence, Iowa, claimed to have seen a flying monster with horns on its head. The person even said that the monster had the mouth of an alligator with green scales that covered its entire body. Even more fascinating, and perhaps terrifying, as recently as 2005, a dragon was sighted in Burlington, Iowa by a witness simply known as Megan. Megan claimed that she saw the beast in the middle of the night while driving home with her husband, and that the monster had a 10-foot-long, snake-like body with bat-like wings and a seahorse head. Now, when we compare all of these sightings with the Van Meter visitor, we immediately see some similarities. The ability to fly, for instance, the huge bat-like wings, and the staggering size of the creatures. Plus, remember that one of the townspeople had called the monster antediluvian, which suggests that the beast looked prehistoric. That fits very much within the dragon worldview, and might also explain why the prowler was able to escape gunfire completely unharmed. Alright, on to our second theory, which is the New Jersey Devil theory. This one is rather interesting. Here goes. First off, like the name suggests, the Jersey Devil was native to the New Jersey area in the United States, and according to some accounts, sightings of the Jersey Devil have been going on from the 1800s even up till today. But here's the really strange thing. Between 1903, when the Van Meter visitor terrorized Iowa, and 1909, there were no reports of the Jersey Devil in the New Jersey area at all. So, is it possible that the creature grew bored with New Jersey and decided to try a different location? Well, for one, the Jersey Devil and the Van Meter visitor do share a striking number of similarities. For instance, both creatures have been described as having bat-like wings. They are also both nocturnal, have the ability to fly, and both have 4 limbs. So, case closed, mystery solved? Well, we still have 2 other theories left to explore, and the next one we'll be looking at is the Ultraterrestrial theory. Basically, an ultraterrestrial, if you haven't heard the term before, is like a UFO, but instead of simply being from another planet, an ultraterrestrial is from another dimension altogether. A quick search done on ultraterrestrials shows that they are believed to enter our world through interdimensional gaps known as liminal places. A good example of a liminal place would be a crossroads, and as it turns out, Van Meter happens to sit on a crossroads. Holders of the ultraterrestrial theory believe that it doesn't just explain the Van Meter visitor's sighting, it also explains the reason behind Van Meter's unusually high number of sightings and hauntings. For instance, the old high school was said to be haunted, as was Fat Randy's Bar and Grill, the Brick Factory, and even the Raccoon River. The town was also fraught with tales of unusual sightings, from hairy werewolves to Bigfoot-like creatures, and now to the Van Meter visitor. So could it be true? Is the Van Meter visitor an ultra-terrestrial being? Well, its behavior is definitely quite baffling. Plus, it appears impervious to human weapons, which makes sense for a being that can travel interdimensionally. And it apparently also had the ability to disappear at will, so the ultra-terrestrial theory isn't exactly far-fetched. This takes us to the final theory we will be looking at today, the UFO theory. Now, of all the theories surrounding the Van Meter visitor, perhaps the UFO theory carries the most weight. There are so many pieces of evidence that point to the fact that the people of Van Meter might have witnessed a UFO, and we're going to look into each one right away. The first point is the mysterious lights on the creature's beak, which is a common experience with UFO sightings. In fact, in 1897, about 6 years before the Van Meter visitor's sightings, some Iowans reported seeing a UFO flying in the sky with characteristics that have some similarities with the Van Meter visitor. Besides the fact that both sightings were affirmed by prominent and respectable members of the community, the 1897 UFO was also observed to move in a swaying motion like a bird, and tended to dart around from place to place. But it gets even more eerily similar. According to an April 10th article in the Waterloo Courier, a certain druggist named J.K. Joder had sighted the strange UFO at around 1 in the morning. Joder also claimed that the object glided through the air like a bat with eyes of fire. But as he looked closer at the object, he discovered that it was actually a vehicle and that there were several odd-looking beings speaking a language he had never heard before while repairing their craft. Again, the similarities are striking because the Van Meter visitor also seemed to have a thing for visiting Van Meter at around 1 a.m. Plus, when Joder saw this craft, he thought the object looked like an enormous bat, which is pretty much what the Van Meter residents thought too. And then, let's not forget the eyes of fire, which sounds a lot like what the Van Meter residents observed as a brilliant, blinding light coming from the Van Meter visitor's beak. In fact, when the 1897 UFO was first sighted, people who saw it claimed that the object could not be discerned except for two flickering white lights that moved from side to side. Again, very similar to the Van Meter visitor. Another point to make here is that the Van Meter visitor seemed impervious to human weapons. Once again, this suggests that the UFO theory might be right, because if there are beings outside our planet who have developed the technology to drop in on us unannounced, then being able to fend off our weapons shouldn't be a big issue for such beings. The Van Meter visitor was shot multiple times at extremely close ranges, and still, none of the bullets had any effect. Of course, there's always the possibility that the shooters lost their composure because they were rattled by the sheer size of the creature. But that doesn't seem like a very good explanation for why Dr. Alcott would miss 5 shots at close range, or why Peter Dunn would miss his own shot as well, or why none of the men in the entire posse at the coal mine was able to bring down the creature. In fact, after Dunn shot the creature, or at least tried to shoot it, when he went out to look for the body, he didn't find it, of course, but he also didn't find any trace of blood, no bits of fur, no skin, no feathers. And it's really bizarre because Dunn was using buckshot shells. One buckshot shell contains several pellets of shot, such that when it is fired, the pellets produce a scattergun effect, which makes targets much easier to hit. Yet, the Van Meter visitor somehow managed to sail away unharmed. This was definitely not an ordinary beast. The next point that makes this UFO theory more likely is the missing time. After O.V. White saw the creature on the telephone pole and tried to shoot at it, he smelled an overwhelming stench coming from the Van Meter visitor, and that was the last thing he could remember. This missing time experience tracks perfectly with the experiences of alien contactees. In 1961, on September 9th, Betty and Barney Hill were going back to their home in New Hampshire when they saw a bright light in the sky following them. After stepping out of the car to observe the phenomenon more closely, Barney discovered that the light following them was actually a UFO. So he rushed back to the car ready to drive off. But then the object landed on their car. The couple heard some strange beeps, and that was the last thing they could remember. When the couple finally came to themselves, they discovered that they had lost about 3 hours, and that they were now about 30 miles away from the last place they remembered stopping at. They also had this overwhelmingly strange feeling that something unnatural had happened to them. And by the time they underwent hypnotic therapy to retrieve their lost memories, they found that they had been abducted by alien beings from the craft that had been following them. So you see this common thread of missing time and lost memory running through established tales of abduction, which is yet another reason the Van Meter visitor could have been an alien or a UFO, right? Well, probably. But there's still the very real possibility that this whole thing was just a hoax. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. The first mention of these Van Meter visitor sightings was in the Des Moines Daily News in the Special Features section. This section was not restricted to journalists alone. Anyone with an opinion could make use of the Special Features section to share their beliefs, which was exactly what happened with the first report of the Van Meter visitor. The article was written by one Mr. H.H. Phillips, who was not a journalist. So couldn't it be possible that Phillips simply made up the entire half-human, half-bat story to make some money? Besides, in the second article published about the Van Meter visitor, the second author did admit that the first story had been largely exaggerated. So this proves Phillips wrong, right? Well, not exactly. For one, the second article claimed that the sighting was probably a practical joker or a hoaxer. The only problem is this hoaxer was shot multiple times by multiple different people, and yet they didn't die or suffer any injuries. Secondly, this creature was reported as being about 8 feet tall with wings. At the time, Americans were significantly shorter than they are now, and the average man was about 5 feet 10 inches tall. So even if said hoaxer was wearing a costume, they'd also have to be on stilts to look that tall. Now, throw in the fact that the alleged hoaxer was seen darting about, running, and even flying, and you see why the hoaxer theory is quite far-fetched. Besides, in Phillips' article, he mentioned the names of some upstanding citizens in the town. 2 were merchants, 1 a doctor, 1 a salesman, 1 a mine director, and another a bank teller who eventually became the bank manager. Why would these citizens allow their good names to be associated with a hoax and not do anything about it unless they also stood by the content of the article? Besides, if Phillips was making the whole thing up, then he must have been straight up prescient, because the things he talks about in his article predate any recorded UFO literature by decades, and yet they're so accurate. But does that make the other theories right? Did the Van Meter visitors really see something out of the ordinary, like a dragon, the Jersey Devil, or a UFO? Well, the answer is complicated. Before we begin to reach for extraordinary answers, we should probably consider more ordinary answers. Only when these ordinary answers fail to solve the mystery satisfactorily should we reach for the extraordinary. Occam's razor, right? So, what's a more likely explanation? Maybe it was just a regular unidentified species? After all, scientists have said that up to 86% of Earth's species still haven't been discovered. That's a whole lot, especially when you consider that extinction has been speeding up seriously, with 100 to 10,000 species going extinct every year. To put this in perspective, it means that between 1903 and now, between 100,000 and 1 million of Earth's species have gone extinct, and of those thousands, most were never identified. So who's to say that the Van Meter visitor wasn't just one of such species? It's not solid proof, obviously, but it does make you think, could this have been an unidentified bird? Anyway, while you think about that, here's another theory for you. What if the respectable leaders of the time were in cahoots? What if they all concocted this story to save their town? Here's what I mean. Around the time of these alleged sightings, Van Meter was going through an economic downturn. Its coal mine had packed up, and even had to be turned into a brick and tile factory. Perhaps the town's citizens had thought that a publicity stunt was just what the town needed to turn its fortunes around. But then, if that's the case, why tell such an outlandish story? Well, as it turns out, outlandish stories seem to have been a thing in the 19th century. They were even profitable in many cases. For instance, in 1869, a group of workers claimed to have discovered the remains of a prehistoric giant while working on a farm in Cardiff, New York. Obviously, the story had been very thrilling to read, but it turned out to be a hoax. Shortly before the discovery, a businessman by the name of George Hull had had the statue carved out of a 10-foot block of gypsum and then buried to be discovered later. The entire shebang cost Hull about $2,000. But after the alleged giant was discovered and set up for display, Hull charged an admission fee of 50 cents, and then, after a few years, sold his interests and walked away with a whopping $23,000. Not bad for a $2,000 investment, right? So maybe this was what the leaders of Van Meter were trying to replicate. Or maybe it was just mass hysteria? It isn't entirely far-fetched to think that this Van Meter monster was purely a product of the town's shared fears and anxiety. After all, in 1903, America was still recovering from a bloody civil war that had killed 1 in 5 soldiers and about 2% of the entire population. Such trauma is enough to make people anxious, which is a good breeding ground for an unusual sighting to morph into an enormous bat-winged beast that causes widespread paranoia. However, you'd have to admit that even the mass hysteria theory doesn't exactly work, as the experiences of the Van Meter residents don't fit well with established cases of mass hysteria, which usually involve physical symptoms. What then was this mysterious being that terrorized the town of Van Meter? It seems like we may never know.